Today we're going to be looking at another one of Veritasium's videos. We're going to be looking at what the prisoner's dilemma reveals about the life, the universe, and everything. Prisoner's dilemma comes up quite a bit in the context of both nuclear weapons and nuclear power. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Tyler Folse. I'm a nuclear engineer with a little over 10 years of experience in the commercial nuclear power industry. From engineering to operations to emergency response. I don't claim to know everything there is nuclear, but I can certainly share some knowledge. Let's get right into it.
This is a video about the most famous problem in game theory. Problems of this sort pop up everywhere, from nations locked in conflict to roommates doing the dishes. Even game shows have been based around this concept. Figuring out the best strategy can mean the difference between life and death, war and peace, flourishing and the destruction of the planet. And in the mechanics...
Again, for those of you who are used to me, gotta leave my obligatory comment about nuclear weapons can't actually destroy the Earth, even if all of them were launched and detonated at once. I did a reaction to a Kurzgesagt video that what if we detonated all the nuclear bombs at once, and talked a lot more detail about that in that video. I'll pin a comment down below if you're interested to hear more about it. But the short answer is no, they would not.
Of this game, we may find the very source of one of the most unexpected phenomena in nature. Cooperation.
Yes.
On the 3rd of September 1949, an American weather monitoring plane collected air samples over Japan. In those samples, they found traces of radioactive material. The Navy quickly collected and tested rainwater samples from their ships and bases all over the world. They also detected small amounts of cerium-141 and yttrium-91. But these isotopes have half-lives of 1 or 2 months, so they must have been produced recently. And the only place they could have come from was a nuclear explosion. But the US hadn't performed any tests that year, so the only possible conclusion was that the Soviet Union had figured out how to make a nuclear bomb.
And that must have been from air tests, which were actually similar to the nuclear attack on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And the reason why you would do an air burst for an attack would be because it does the majority of the damage to buildings, cities, targets, and it's going to fling radioactive material miles and miles away, compared to a ground attack, which wouldn't do as much damage, but it would cause a lot more contamination down to the ground. And the radioisotopes wouldn't be blown as far, typically. Now, part of it is a bit weather dependent on where the air currents are going as to where you're actually going to see these sort of things. And the interesting thing about those isotopes is they have a high probability of occurring from fission. So here's a few curves from uranium-235 or plutonium-239, which are commonly used in nuclear weapons and in nuclear power plants for that matter. Though the main difference is the concentration of uranium-235 is far higher in nuclear weapons, above 90%, compared to the 3 to 5% you see in nuclear power plants. But the fission reaction is the same. They mention isotopes in the 90 to 100 range and isotopes in the 130 to 140 range. Those have a fairly high probability of showing up.
This was the news the Americans had been dreading. Their military supremacy, achieved through the Manhattan Project, was quickly fading.
Yeah. Well, there were spies during the Manhattan Project.
Europe and the United States
Soviet
far more
spies.
serious than it was before, and perhaps makes the imminence of war greater.
Some thought their best course of action was to launch an unprovoked nuclear strike against the Soviets while they were still ahead.
This is crazy just thinking about this sort of thing. I mean, yeah, you need to consider when doing any sort of brainstorming, let's get all the bad ideas out of the way first. Like, yeah, launching an unprovoked nuclear attack. I'm sure that would go over well. Not to mention wanton slaughter of innocent people. But you'll see this in brainstorming. You get all the bad ideas out of the way first, so you know not to do it.
Words of Navy Secretary Matthews to become aggressors for peace. John von Neumann, the founder of game theory, said, "If you say, why not bomb them tomorrow? I say, why not bomb them today? If you say today at 5 o'clock, I say, why not at 1 o'clock?
I see what he's doing.
Something needed to be done about nuclear weapons, and fast. But what? In 1950, the RAND Corporation, a US-based think tank, was studying this question.
I didn't know RAND was that old.
And as part of this research, they turned to game theory. That same year, two mathematicians at RAND had invented a new game, one which, unbeknownst to them at the time, closely resembled the US-Soviet conflict.
This game is now known as the prisoner's dilemma. So let's play a game.
A banker with a chest full of gold coins invites you
game.
and another player to play against each other. You each get two choices. You can cooperate or you can defect. If you both cooperate, you each get 3 coins. If one of you cooperates but the other defects, then the one who defected gets 5 coins and the other gets nothing. And if you both defect, then you each get a coin.
I see this came up. We did a team building exercise where you basically lock hands with your partner, and it's like whoever scores, and your objective is to score the most amount of points. And you do it when you get a point when you push your partner's hand to their side. So what's interesting is you'll see a lot of people adopt the kind of tug of war formation where they're trying to go one way or the other. But I remember, like, with my partner, it's like, hey, it says we get a point. Let's just go back and forth, offer no resistance to the other person as fast as we can, and see how many points we can both get as quickly as possible. I remember that as a little corporate team building exercise.
The goal of the game is simple: to get as many coins as you can.
So, what would you do?
Suppose your opponent cooperates, then you could also cooperate and get 3 coins. Or you could defect and get 5 coins instead. So you are better off defecting. But what if your opponent defects instead? Well, you could cooperate and get no coins, or you could defect and at least get 1 coin. So no matter what your opponent does, your best option is always to defect.
Now, if your opponent is also rational, they will reach the same conclusion and therefore also defect.
As a result, when you both act rationally, you both end up in the suboptimal situation, getting 1 coin each, when you could have gotten 3 instead. In the case of the US and Soviet Union,
the key bit is you can't talk to the other person. That's kind of why I was able to subvert it, and that wasn't really a true prisoner's dilemma, because we could at least say, hey, let's try this. But here it's like, no, you're locked. That's why it's the prisoner's dilemma.
This led both countries to develop huge nuclear arsenals of tens of thousands of nuclear weapons each, more than enough to destroy each other many times over.
But
on that note, so difficult, I remember seeing declassified stuff. Now, it depends what you mean by destroy each other. Again, it depends what they mean by many times over. If they're talking just hitting their nuclear missile launchers to take out the other person, that's a lot different from completely wiping the country off the face of the map.
Since both countries had nukes, neither could use them. And both countries spent around $10 trillion developing these weapons.
Sure.
Both would have been better off if they had cooperated and agreed not to develop this technology further. But since they both acted in their own
or
best
at least not
interest,
use it against
they
each
ended
other.
up in a situation where everyone was worse off. The prisoner's dilemma is one of the most famous games in game theory. Thousands and thousands of papers have been published on versions of this game. In part, that's because it pops up everywhere.
Impalas, living in between African woodlands and savannas, are prone to catching ticks, which can lead to infectious diseases, paralysis, even death. So it's important for impalas to remove ticks, and they do this by grooming. But they can't reach all the spots on their bodies, and therefore they need another impala to groom them. Now, grooming someone else comes at a cost. It costs saliva, electrolytes, time, and attention, all vital resources under the hot African sun, where a predator could strike at any moment. So for the other impala, it would be best not to pay this cost. But then again, it too will need help grooming. So all impalas face a choice. Should they groom each other or not? In other words, should they cooperate or defect?
Well, if they only interact once, then the rational solution is always to defect. That other Impala is never going to help you, so why bother? But the thing about a lot of problems is that they're not a single prisoner's dilemma.
Impalas see each other day after day, and the same situation keeps happening over and over again. So that changes the problem. Because instead of playing the prisoner's dilemma just once, you're now playing it many, many times. And if I defect now, then my opponent will know that I defected, and they can use that against me in the future.
Exactly how, and unfortunately it went the other direction during the arms race with nuclear weapons, because like, ooh, they're building more nukes, so now I have to build more nukes, because then I will be more vulnerable to aggression. So I don't want to build nukes, certainly don't want to use nukes, but we got to, even though that's going to make the nuclear exchange that much more dangerous, because there is some... Part of it's the whole fear thing about that. That's a very real fear that Veritasium pointed out, of actually causing a mutual assured destruction. It wouldn't be completely everything, especially because sub-launch nuclear weapons exist, so there would be, and their locations are largely unknown by both sides. Now, that isn't to say one side couldn't find each other, but there is that risk of second strike that comes up. So it's not... Even the mutual assured destruction doesn't quite work based on that technology. But instead, that almost makes it worse, because then you can build more and more nukes, and then it's just going to cause more and more damage, even though you're building more nukes to try to stop that. It's a bit of a paradox.
So, what is the best strategy in this repeated game? That is what Robert Axelrod, a political scientist, wanted to find out. So in 1980, he decided to hold a computer tournament.
He invited some of the world's leading game theorists from many different subjects to submit computer programs that would play each other.
Axelrod called these programs strategies.
For more games.
Each strategy would face off against every other strategy and against a copy of itself. And each matchup would go for 200 rounds. That's important, and we'll come back to it. Now, Axelrod used points instead of coins, but the payoffs were the same. The goal of the tournament was to win as many points as possible. And in the end, the whole tournament was repeated 5 times over to ensure the success was robust and not just a fluke. Axelrod gave an example of a simple strategy.
I've also seen a variant of this where you give kids some cookies and you tell them, hey, if you can leave these cookies alone for 10, 15 minutes, something like that, a time that's a long time to be sitting in the room with cookies and not want to eat them, especially for a kid. And we'll give you twice as many cookies, and a lot of them would just eat it. But if the same contestants repeat this enough times, they'll eventually realize, hey, we're going to get more cookies.
It would start each game by cooperating and only defect after its opponent had defected twice in a row. In total, Axelrod received 14 strategies, and he added a 15th called random, which just randomly cooperates or defects 50% of the time. All strategies were loaded onto a single computer where they faced off against each other. One of the strategies was called Freedman. It starts off by cooperating, but if its opponent defects just once, it will keep defecting for the remainder of the game. Another strategy was called Joss. It also starts by cooperating, but then it just copies what the other player did on the last move. Then around 10% of the time, Joss gets sneaky and defects. There was also a rather elaborate strategy called Grass Camp. This strategy works the same as Joss, but instead of defecting probabilistically, Grass Camp defects in the 50th round to try and probe the strategy of its opponent
just to see what happens.
It can take advantage of any weaknesses.
Wow.
The most elaborate strategy was Name Withheld, with 77 lines of code. After all the games were played, the results were tallied up and the leaderboard established.
The crazy thing was that the simplest program ended up winning, a program that came to be called Tit for Tat.
Tit for Tat starts by cooperating, and then it copies exactly what its opponent did in the last move. So it would follow cooperation with cooperation, and
just like in the arms race or reduction, as we're seeing now, you build more nukes, it builds more nukes, you reduce nukes, they reduce nukes.
Defection with defection. But only once. If its opponent goes back to cooperating, so does Tit for Tat. When Tit for Tat played against Friedman, both started by cooperating, and they kept cooperating, both ending up with perfect scores for complete cooperation. When Tit for Tat played against Joss, they too started by cooperating, but then on the 6th move, Joss defected. This sparked a series of back-and-forth defections, a sort of echo effect.
Okay, so now you've got this alternating thing, which will remind you of some of the politics of the world today, where we have to do something to you because of what you did to us.
Yep.
And then when this
Proportional
weird program
responses.
throws in a second unprovoked defection, now it's really bad, because now both programs are going to defect
gonna
on
be
each
locked
other
in
for the rest of the game.
Yep.
And that's also like some of the things that we're seeing in politics today and in international relations.
This is fascinating. I like this idea.
Result of these mutual retaliations, both Tit for Tat and Joss did poorly.
But because Tit for Tat managed to cooperate with enough other strategies, it still won the tournament.
We're being joined.
Hey, my God, there's Professor Axelrod.
Hey, there's Steven Stonehearts.
I actually got them.
Wow, what a
awesome.
treat this is.
And I imagined initially it'd be sort of like computer chess, where you need a pretty complicated program to play a sophisticated game. But in fact, it was not like that at all. It was the simplest strategy that did the best. So I analyzed how that happened.
Axelrod found that all the best performing strategies, including Tit for Tat, shared 4 qualities.
First, they were all nice, which just means they are not the first to defect. So Tit for Tat is a nice strategy. It can defect, but only in retaliation. The opposite of nice is nasty. That's a strategy that defects
Quote unquote
first.
nice and nasty.
So
That's
Joss
funny.
is nasty. Out of the 15 strategies in the tournament, 8 were nice and 7 nasty. The top 8 strategies were all
Not
nice.
naughty or nice?
And even the worst performing nice strategy still far outscored the best performing nasty one. The second...
There you go. If you want statistical evidence of how to be nice, let's just examine the results. Spread it far and wide.
important quality was being forgiving. A forgiving strategy is one that can retaliate, but it doesn't hold a grudge. So Tit for Tat is a forgiving strategy. It retaliates when its opponent defects, but it doesn't let defections from before the last round influence its current decisions. Friedman, on the other hand, is maximally unforgiving.
After the first defection, just from the opponent would defect for the rest of the game. Okay, that's it.
Yeah.
No mercy. And that might feel good to do, but it doesn't end up working out well in the long run.
Where is he?
This conclusion
Relatively low.
that it pays to be nice and forgiving came as a shock to the experts. Many had tried to be tricky and create subtle,
'Cause you're
nasty
playing multiple
strategies to
ones,
beat their
yeah.
opponent and eke out an advantage. But they all failed.
The other thing is just the idea of looking at it like the other person getting points as well, because the key thing of it, if you defect and the other one collaborates, you're getting 5 and they're getting 0, but the other one, you're both getting 3, so the net benefit to both sides. So if you start looking at it from that perspective, things are getting way better. It's one of the reasons why a lot of big energy companies as well are looking at environmental impact into their bottom line, is because they're looking at long-term sustainability and the ability to continue to collaborate together for the long term, not strip mine and expend a bunch of resources. Just better. It just makes more sense, even if it's not out of the kindness of your heart.
In this tournament, nice guys finished first.
There you go.
Now, Tit for Tat is quite forgiving, but it's possible to be even more forgiving. Axelrod's sample strategy only defects after its opponent defected twice in a row. It was Tit for 2 tats. Now, that might sound overly generous, but when Axelrod ran the numbers, he found that if anyone had submitted the sample strategy, they would have won the tournament.
Love it. The sample.
I mean, it's so
the
clever.
default
There's
strategy.
so many layers to this story. After Axelrod published his analysis of what happened, or circulated it among these game theorists, he said, now that we all know what worked well, let's try again.
So he announced a second tournament where everything would be the same except for one change: the number of rounds per game.
See, in the first tournament, each game lasted precisely 200 rounds. And that is important, because if you know when the last round is, then there's no reason to cooperate in that round. So you're better off defecting.
Yeah,
of course, your
that's
opponent should
interesting.
reason the same, and so they should also defect in the last round. But if you both anticipate defection in the last round,
Assume an
then there's no
infinite number
reason
of
for you to
rounds.
cooperate in the second to last round, or the round before that, and so on all the way to the very first round.
And so in Axelrod's tournament, it was a very important thing that the players didn't know exactly how long they were going to be playing.
Yep.
They knew on average it
Just
would
like
be
we don't know how
200
long we're gonna be
rounds,
living.
But there was a random number generator that prevented them from knowing with certainty.
Yeah, if you're not sure when it ends, then you have to kind of keep cooperating because it might keep going and you might need them on your side.
It's a great thing. We don't know how long we're going to live. Let's just keep cooperating forever. I love it.
Yeah.
For this second tournament, Axelrod received 62 entries and again added random. The contestants had gotten the results and analysis from the first tournament and could use this information to their advantage. This created two camps. Some thought that clearly being nice and forgiving were winning qualities, so they submitted nice and forgiving strategies.
Cute little
One even
green.
submitted tit for two tats. The second camp anticipated that others would be nice and extra forgiving, and therefore they submitted nasty strategies to try to take advantage
evil
of
orange
those that
ones.
were extra forgiving. One such strategy was called Tester. It would defect on the first move to see how its opponent reacted. If it retaliated, Tester would apologize and play tit for tat for the remainder of the game.
That's
if
funny.
it didn't retaliate, Tester would defect every other move after that. But again, being nasty didn't pay.
And once again, tit for tat was the most effective.
Nice strategies again did much better. In the top 15, only one was not nice. Similarly,
The
in the bottom
anomaly.
15, only one was not nasty.
After
Being
the second
unforgiven is
tournament,
nasty that they showed
Axelrod
Friedman
identified
again.
the other qualities that distinguished the better performing strategies.
The third is being retaliatory, which means if your opponent defects, strike back immediately.
Strike back.
Don't be a pushover. Always cooperate is a total pushover, and so it's very easy to take advantage of. Tit for tat, on the other hand, is very hard to take advantage of. The last quality that Axelrod identified is being clear.
Programs that were too opaque, that were too similar to a random program, you couldn't figure them out
Sure.
because they were so complicated. It was very hard to establish any pattern of trust with a program like that because you couldn't figure out what it was doing.
That's a good point.
I mean, the other programs it was playing couldn't figure them out. And so they would end up more or less default.
I like that these are almost kind of like a bit of like life lessons, like be nice, be forgiven, stand up to people if they bully you though, but also be clear on what your relationship should look like. This is just taken to the direction I didn't immediately think it would go.
To thinking every turn is like the last time I'm going to see you, so I might as well defect. What to me is
relationship
mind-blowing
advice.
about this is that these four principles, being nice, forgiving, provocable, and clear, is a lot like the morality that has evolved around the world that is often summarized as an eye for an eye.
This is fascinating stuff. One thing is this game theory, this prisoner's dilemma does also come up in nuclear power as well, though I think it's a bit more driven by, it's driven by fear, but it's about proliferation more so because nuclear power is just, it's all wonderful, peaceful way of generating massive amounts of electricity. But it's all about the risks of proliferation, the fear of betrayal, or eventually using it, selling your plutonium-239 that you produce to terrorists or all these other nasty things that people think that the other person is going to do could shorten could stop technology agreements, research agreements, global collaboration. But I don't feel like there's as much there, especially when it comes to things like fusion, building sites like ITER. Now, part of it could be a bunch of pessimism about the stuff actually working, or we're still being so far away from it, whereas from fission, it's a long practice technology that does amazing, wonderful things for us. But I don't know. I don't know what your thoughts are on about that, but it seems like the prisoner's dilemma for nuclear power is a bit more on the order of fear of other things you could do with nuclear material just by having it for nuclear power rather than actually spreading nuclear power to other countries, kind of in the case that that it exists for the weapons stuff.
It's not Christianity, by the way. It's not turn the other cheek philosophy. It's some older philosophy.
Not an eye for an eye, the Pharisees.
What's interesting is that while Tit for Tats would have won the first tournament, it only came 24th in the second tournament.
This highlights an important fact. In the repeated prisoner's dilemma, there is no single best strategy. The strategy that performs best always depends on the other strategies it's interacting with.
For example, if you put Tit for Tat in an environment with only the ultimate bullies of always defect, then Tit for Tat comes in last.
I wanted to see whether, for example, the Tit for Tat did well because it did well with really stupid rules that didn't do well at all themselves.
Really
It basically took advantage of people.
So he ran a simulation where successful strategies in one generation would see their numbers grow, and unsuccessful ones would see their numbers drop.
That's interesting.
In this simulation, the worst performing strategy...
It's kind of like evaluating... It's a bit like evaluating compound interest of which strategy you should invest in versus when should you change your strategy. That's kind of cool.
Strategies quickly shrink and go extinct, while the top performing strategies become more common.
Yep.
Harrington, the only nasty strategy in the top 15, first grew quickly. But then as the strategies it was preying on went extinct, Harrington's numbers also quickly dropped.
This shows
that's
a main
really cool.
benefit of this simulation because it tests how well a strategy does with other successful strategies.
After 1,000 generations, the proportion...
This should be spread far and wide because you have to think about the long-term impact, which a lot of people just don't think of when it comes to, well, really anything. It could be about investments, could be about energy sources, could be on nuclear arms races. And that nasty strategy right there, that curve looks very similar. It looks a bit like this, though in this case it actually fell off faster in the 1990s. I know they're not correlated, but that's just what it reminded me of. It's encouraging.
Are mostly stable, and only nice strategies survive. Again, Tit for Tat comes out on top, representing 14.5% of the total population.
Now, this process may sound similar to evolution, but there is a subtle difference, which is that in this case there are no mutations, so it's actually an ecological simulation.
But what if the world you started in was different?
Imagine a world that is a really nasty place to live, more or less populated with players that always defect. Except there's a little cluster of tit-for-tat players that live in some kind of nucleus. And they get to play with each other a lot because they're geographically
isolated,
sequestered. They will start building up a lot of points, and also, because that translates into offspring, they'll start to take over the population. So, in fact, Axelrod showed that a little island of cooperation can emerge and spread.
Oh, that's beautiful.
And eventually will take over the world, which is fantastic.
That's amazing.
How can cooperation emerge in a population of players who are self-interested, who are not trying to be good because they're good-hearted? You don't have to be altruistic. You could be looking out for number one, for yourself and your own interests, and yet cooperation can still emerge.
Some argue that this could explain how we went from a world full of completely selfish organisms, where every organism only cared about themselves, to one where cooperation emerged and flourished.
Oh, he missed an opportunity to show some selfish shellfish.
From impalas grooming each other to fish cleaning sharks. Many life forms experience conflicts similar to the prisoner's dilemma, but because they don't interact just once, both can be better off by cooperating.
And that's the big thing. We're not prisoners. We can talk to each other and have long relationships with each other. That's why it's so wonderful for us.
And this doesn't require trust or conscious thought either, because the strategy could be encoded in DNA. As long as it performs better than the other strategies,
if you do it for long enough,
it can take over a population.
Beautiful.
Axelrod's insights were applied to areas like evolutionary biology and international conflicts. But there was one aspect that his original tournaments didn't cover. What happens if there is a little bit of random error in the game, some noise in the system? For example, one player tries to cooperate, but it comes across as a defection.
Oh, that's
Little
a good point.
errors like this happen in the real world all the time.
Like in 1983, the Soviet satellite-based early warning system detected the launch of an intercontinental ballistic missile from the US. But the US hadn't launched anything. The Soviet system had confused sunlight reflecting off high-altitude clouds with a ballistic missile.
And this right here is why you have redundant, diverse, separate, independent systems so you can validate your indications. Plus a bit of logic of saying, why would this happen unprovoked? But you look at, that's why you need different sources of indications. This comes up a lot within nuclear power plants, and this was one contributing reason to the 3 Mile Island accident, is a lot of the operators thought that if they left their emergency core cooling system on, they were going to overfill and overpressurize their reactor coolant system, because their indication said their reactor coolant system was full. However, what happened was they had a big steam void in the vessel that pushed bits and pieces of water up to the top. So it said it was full, even though there was this big gap, this big hole, and they needed their emergency core cooling system, but they were saying, it's too full, let's turn it off. If they would have left that on, there would have been no accident whatsoever.
Thankfully, Stanislav Petrov, the Soviet officer on duty, dismissed the alarm.
But this example shows the potential costs of a signal error and the importance of studying the effects of noise on those strategies.
The word game sounds like it's a children's game, or, there's something a misnomer maybe in calling it game theory, because these are life and death matters, obviously.
Well, life's a game, right?
As you mentioned that this came up in the Cold War. I mean, it could actually be life and death of the whole planet. We could annihilate human civilization. So these are not games.
I'm going to go back to my previous comment. If you want to see my thoughts in more detail on nuclear weapons ending all civilization, I'll pin a comment to that other video where I look at Kurzgesagt's "let's detonate all the nukes at once."
In any kind of trivial sense. It's just the term that is used by mathematicians and theorists.
When tit for tat plays against itself in a noisy environment, both start off by cooperating. But if a single cooperation is perceived as a defection, then the other tit for tat retaliates, and it sets off a chain of alternating retaliations. And if another cooperation is perceived as a defection, then the rest of the game is constant mutual defection. Therefore, in the long run, both would only get a third of the points they would get in a perfect environment. Tit for tat goes from performing very well to performing poorly.
So, how do you solve this? Well, you need a reliable way to break out of these echo effects.
That and just a more reliable way of filtering out the noise, like I mentioned early with the diverse indication. And in terms of communication, are you sure that's what you meant? Just simple clarifications can help close that out. But I know he's talking strictly about the game.
And one way to do this is by playing tit for tat, but with around 10% more forgiveness.
So instead of retaliating after every defection, you only retaliate around 9 out of every 10 times. This helps you break out of those echoes while still being retaliatory enough to not be taken advantage of.
And so we also ran the tournament.
This kind of works like a control loop when getting something to stabilize rather than like opening and closing a valve to, say, trying to maintain level in a tank just so it doesn't go back and forth too much. It's a way of kind of dialing in on any control system. There are types of controllers that use rate component to help dial things in for a more smooth control of whether it's level in a tank, temperature, pressure, because ultimately we want everything to be at their stable 100% power parameters, both at a nuclear power plant and in real life, and in the rest of real life.
With noise and generosity. And that did quite well.
Big misconception.
My favorite example is tit for tat does really well, but it could never do better than the player it's playing with.
I mean, think about it. By design, all they can do is lose or draw.
And yet, when the results of all interactions are tallied up, they come out ahead of all other strategies. Similarly, Always defect can never lose a game. It can only draw or win. but overall, it performs extremely poorly.
Yeah.
This highlights a common misconception, because for many people, when they think about winning, they think they need to beat the other person.
And that goes back to the previous example of the handshake tug-of-war thing. Just have both sides take 3 and get 6 points, so the society is better off overall. The global society is.
In games like chess or poker, this is true, since one person's gain is necessarily another person's loss.
And this is why when my family and I have a bunch of fun board game nights, we like playing a bunch of collaborative games like the pandemic game. Interesting thing about when we played that game, the legacy pandemic game, it actually lasted longer than the real COVID pandemic, which is kind of funny. But the point of games like that is you all work together to beat a pretty hard board game, being your opponent. And it's a lot more fun.
So these games are zero-sum.
But most of life is not zero-sum.
Nope.
To win, you don't need to get your reward from the other player. Instead, you can get it from the banker.
I see what he means about the big misconception. Yes, life, relationships, friendships, money, it's not zero-sum. It's really not.
Only in real life, the banker is the world. It is literally everything around you. It is just up to us to find those win-win situations and then work together to unlock those rewards. Cooperation pays, even among rivals.
From 1950 to 1986, the US and Soviet Union had trouble cooperating, and both kept developing nukes. But then, from the late 80s onwards, they started reducing their nuclear stockpiles.
They too had learned how to resolve
conflict. Just like that point I brought up earlier.
Rather than making an agreement to abolish all nuclear arms at once and essentially turning it into a single prisoner's dilemma, they would disarm slowly, a small number of nukes each year. And then they'd check each other to see that they had both cooperated.
Trust and verify.
And then repeat the year after, and the year after that, all along checking to ensure mutual cooperation. In the more than 40 years since Axelrod's tournaments, researchers have continued to study which strategies perform best in a variety of environments. In doing so, they varied everything from payoff structures to strategies to errors and more. Some even allowed the strategies to mutate. While tit for tat or generous tit for tat doesn't always come out on top, Axelrod's main takeaways still hold. Be nice, forgiving, but don't be a pushover.
Can I ask you, why did Anatole Rappaport submit tit for tat?
Well, the reason was because I asked him to. and
Gotta love it.
He wrote saying, yeah, I'm willing to do that, but I just want to be clear that I'm not sure that this is really such a good idea. He was a peace researcher, and I think his own inclinations were to be much more forgiving and maybe and not be so provocable.
What I find fascinating is that one of the main things that sets life apart from non-living things is that life gets to make decisions. We get to make choices that don't only change our future, but also the future of those we interact with.
See, in the short term, it is often the environment that shapes the player, that determines who does well, but in the long run, it is the players that shape the environment. So let's play a game, the game of life, and make your choices wisely, because their impact may reach further than you think.
What a nice, uplifting message. I've really enjoyed watching this, and it's one of those that leaves you with a good, warm fuzzy at the end of it. But I also find it, at least anecdotally, now I haven't done a ton of research on this, so I didn't go too deep into the numbers on this, but it's good to know that there is some evidence supporting this, and I especially like just rules to live behind. Be kind, be forgiving, but don't be a pushover, and be clear on what you want and what you need. Thank you very much for watching. I'll see you next time.